A wildfire burned 25,000 acres of Everglades sawgrass. Firefighters expected the standard aftermath: blackened marsh, displaced wildlife, the usual post fire checklist nobody gets excited about. Instead, when survey crews flew over the scorched land, once the smoke cleared, they spotted something that stopped the entire operation cold. Dozens of raised, oddly geometric patches of dark earth were poking up out of the ash, where every map on record said there should be nothing but flat, empty water and grass. The wilderness that was never wild. Let's start with the story everyone already knew. Because the Everglades has spent the better part of a century being marketed, managed, and legally protected as one of the last truly untouched wildernesses left in North America. That's the pitch on the postcards. That's what the ranger station signs say. That's honestly what most of us grew up believing without ever questioning it for a single second. Because why would you? And honestly, who has time? A slow moving river of grass, 60 miles wide, stretching from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Florida Bay, home to alligators, panthers, wood storks, and roughly 1,000 other species that make ecologists genuinely weak in the knees. Since Everglades National Park was formally established back in 1947, the entire conservation framework built around this place has rested on one core assumption: that this was nature operating entirely without a human hand on the wheel. A wild system doing what wild systems do, undisturbed, unchanged, exactly as it had always been. Indigenous people passed through, sure, fished here, hunted here, moved through seasonally, but the landscape itself, the actual physical shape of the marsh, was assumed to be the product of water, limestone, and deep time, not people. That assumption did a lot of heavy lifting for a very long time. It shaped how the land was managed, how it was restored, how billions of dollars in Everglades restoration funding got allocated and prioritized over the decades. It shaped which parcels got protected, which water flows got rerouted, which sections of the park got flagged for ecological intervention, and which ones got quietly filed under "leave it alone, nature's got it handled." It even shaped how the place gets described in every nature documentary you've ever half watched while falling asleep on the couch on a Sunday afternoon. Always some perfectly calm narrator describing an ecosystem shaped entirely by geological forces, water pressure, and evolutionary time, never once mentioning that people might have had their hands in the clay too, never once raising the possibility that the landscape itself might be, in some meaningful sense, a human artifact. And it's the exact assumption that a single dry season wildfire ended up setting on fire right along with the sawgrass. I know how that sounds. The irony is not lost on me, I promise. I'm going to keep going anyway. What's worth understanding before we get to the actual discovery is just how durable that assumption was and why. Not because the scientists building their careers around it were careless or incurious, because the Everglades is genuinely enormous, genuinely punishing to move through on foot, and genuinely extraordinary at hiding things inside 6-foot walls of razor edged grass that make hiking through it an experience most people do not voluntarily repeat. The landscape kept its own secret, quietly and efficiently, for longer than anyone realized it was doing so. And it needed exactly the right kind of disaster to finally give it up. How fireworks in the Everglades fire has always been part of this system. That part is not remotely controversial and never has been. The Everglades isn't really one ecosystem. It's a patchwork of dozens stitched together. Sawgrass marsh, cypress strands, mangrove forest, and scattered slightly elevated patches called tree islands, all sitting on top of a slow, shallow sheet of water moving south. Lightning strikes the sawgrass constantly during the buildup to the wet season. and the marsh actually needs periodic burns to stay healthy, clearing out choking vegetation and cycling nutrients back into the soil. Rangers and fire managers set prescribed burns deliberately for exactly this reason, and have done so for decades. It's routine, it's expected, it's genuinely boring from a headline standpoint, and I mean that with total respect for the people doing it. But an uncontrolled, lightning-driven burn in a dry year behaves differently than a nice, tidy, carefully planned, prescribed one. It moves fast across open sawgrass, sometimes racing at walking pace or faster depending on wind, and it strips away years, sometimes decades, of accumulated thatch and undergrowth in a matter of hours rather than leaving the patchy, stubble-heavy aftermath a managed burn produces. Here's the thing worth pausing on. Sawgrass isn't polite. Left alone for a few years, it grows into dense, waist-high, razor-edged thickets that hide the actual ground contour almost completely from anyone standing at eye level, let alone anyone flying overhead in a small plane looking down. A slow, controlled burn tends to leave a decent amount of root mass and stubble behind. A fast, hot, dry season fire does the opposite. It burns low, it burns thorough, and in the right conditions, it can leave bare dirt looking almost swept clean in places, which meant that for a brief window after the fire moved through, until the next rainy season's growth came back in and swallowed everything again, this stretch of the Everglades was showing its actual skeleton to the sky. For what may have been the first time in living memory, possibly much longer. A window nobody planned for, nobody budgeted for, and nobody on the ground survey team was even slightly prepared for when they climbed into that helicopter to do what was supposed to be a routine wildlife assessment and flew out over the ash. The geometry problem. Nobody expected anything unusual on that flight. Routine post-burn wildlife assessments are exactly what they sound like. You fly the burn zone, you document what moved, what didn't, where things are concentrating now that their cover is gone. You fill out a form, you land, you go home. Instead, the helicopter crews started noticing raised, dark, strangely regular patches breaking the surface in areas that satellite imagery had always shown as flat, uniform marsh, not the gentle, organic, blobby shape you'd expect from a natural hummock building up over centuries of decaying vegetation and compressed plant matter. These had edges. Some were roughly circular. A few, and this is the detail that apparently made people on that helicopter go very quiet, had what looked like straight sides meeting at almost right angles, sitting out in the open where thick sawgrass had hidden them from view for who knows how long. The first working theory was mundane, and it should have been. Peat buildup happens constantly in wetland systems. Dead vegetation compresses over decades and creates slightly raised humps. That's just how marshes work. Nothing mysterious about it, nothing worth writing a paper about, nothing that gets a phone call made to anyone with a PhD in anything. Except peat doesn't usually organize itself into right angles. Peat doesn't know what a right angle is. Peat, generally speaking, does not care about your geometry homework. And that's not me editorializing. That is the actual scientific problem those angles presented to everyone looking at the aerial footage, trying to talk themselves into a boring explanation. So a ground team went in on foot, boots sinking into ash and soft marl, to get a proper look at what they were dealing with rather than guessing from the air. And what they found sitting right on the surface, freshly exposed by a fire that had burned away every scrap of cover, was a scattering of bleached white shell fragments, unmistakably worked stone flakes, and what looked, even to the untrained eye on that first walk through, suspiciously like fired pottery. I want to slow down on that word, worked. Because it's doing a lot of quiet, important work in that sentence, and it's easy to slide past it. A worked stone flake isn't a rock that happened to crack in an interesting way on its own. It's a rock that a person picked up, struck at a specific angle, and shaped on purpose for a specific job, possibly thousands of years ago, by hands that had absolutely no idea anyone would ever be standing here in the ash looking at the result. Finding one lying loose on bare ground in the middle of what every official map called empty sawgrass marsh is not a footnote. That's the kind of find that gets an actual phone call placed to an archaeology department instead of just a wildlife biologist with a clipboard and a species tally. Ruling out the boring answers. Before anyone got ahead of themselves, the team did the responsible thing. They ran through the mundane explanations first, one by one, because that's how good science is supposed to work. You rule out everything boring before you reach for anything exciting. And in South Florida, there are several very reasonable boring explanations available for raised, irregular ground features that didn't exist on any map. Suspect number one was 20th century dredge spoil, leftover dirt piles from the canal digging and flood control projects that reshaped huge sections of South Florida from the 1920s through the 1960s. That's a completely reasonable first guess. This land has been engineered by heavy machinery plenty of times in the last 100 years, and dredge, spoil, really does pile up into raised, sometimes geometric-looking mounds that can fool you from a distance. Except dredge spoil doesn't come packed with freshwater apple snail shell going back thousands of years. And it definitely doesn't radiocarbon date to an era before anyone in Florida had heard of a bulldozer. That theory got ruled out quickly, cleanly, and without much drama. Suspect number two was more reasonable and actually still holds up for a portion of the sites. Seminole and Miccosukee camps from the 18th and 19th centuries. A documented, well-established pattern of temporary settlement on exactly this kind of elevated ground during the Seminole Wars era, when hiding in inaccessible marsh terrain was, understandably, a matter of survival rather than preference. Some of the shallower, more recent material near the surface at a few of these sites almost certainly does trace back to that period. Nobody's disputing that Seminole and Miccosukee communities used tree islands extensively. That's living history, well documented, and genuinely important in its own right. But it doesn't explain the deep layers. It doesn't explain shell strata dating back 3, 4, nearly 5,000 years, sitting underneath those more recent deposits like the bottom pages of a book nobody had opened in a very long time. Whoever built the foundation these later camps were sitting on top of had been doing this for millennia before anyone had heard the word Seminole. The boring explanations ran out. The interesting ones stepped forward. Shell, middens, and what garbage tells you. What the mounds were actually made of matters enormously. Once researchers scraped past the surface layer and looked closely at what was actually holding these features together, it wasn't peat and compressed roots at all. It was shell, specifically freshwater apple snail shells by the millions, packed and layered in a way that simply doesn't happen by accident. Apple snails are a genuine keystone species in this ecosystem, famously the near-exclusive diet of the snail kite, a bird whose entire survival is tied directly to the health of this one snail population, which is its own fascinating rabbit hole I'm going to deliberately not fall into today, because we have enough going on. Snails die naturally, their shells sink, small accumulations happen everywhere in a system like this. That part is not remarkable, but naturally deposited shell doesn't stack itself into dense, uniform layers, meters thick, arranged with the kind of consistency you'd expect from someone dumping basket after basket of processed shellfish waste in the exact same spot, generation after generation, for a length of time that's genuinely difficult to picture while standing in an ash field in South Florida. That's not a snail graveyard. That's a midden, a garbage dump. And I say that as a sincere compliment because middens are some of the richest sources of information about how ancient people actually lived, ate, and organized their days that archaeologists ever get their hands on. There's a reason researchers get unreasonably excited about ancient trash heaps. One person's leftover dinner is another person's 1,000-year time capsule. And that is not a metaphor. That is the actual professional dynamic at work here. So the team dated it. Radiocarbon dating on organic material pulled from deep within those shell layers came back consistently old. Way older than the comfortable assumption of some 19th century settlers passing through and dropping debris. We're talking dates stretching back thousands of years, some samples pushing past 3,000 years, and in a handful of the deepest cores, edging toward 5,000. 5,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's older than the pyramids at Giza were when Julius Caesar was alive. I have furniture that hasn't survived 5 years, and I'm being asked to conceptualize 5,000. I'm doing my best. That's not a hunting party, camping out for one good weekend. That's sustained, repeated, clearly intentional human activity on one specific spot for a length of time that makes most of recorded human history look like a recent development. People built this place. Here's where the story stops being an interesting footnote and becomes something that actually changes the picture. It's one thing to find old shell in a marsh. People have known indigenous communities used the Everglades for thousands of years. That's not controversial, and it never has been. What's controversial, what actually got researchers arguing at conferences, is the growing case that these mounds weren't just used by people passing through. They were built by people deliberately, as engineered high ground in a landscape that spends most of the year sitting underwater. And nobody woke up one morning and announced they were founding a monument. That's what makes the theory so quietly clever. Think about what the daily reality actually looked like. You're a community living in shallow marsh with almost no natural dry land available in any direction for miles. You need somewhere above the waterline to build a shelter, store food, keep your fire going, and get your children a comfortable distance away from an alligator's regular swimming route, which, if you've ever spent an evening near Everglades water at dusk, is a genuinely excellent motivator for doing some light construction work. So you start small, maybe on a natural limestone rise barely poking above the surface, and every meal of apple snails, every fish bone, every basket of debris gets piled in the same spot instead of scattered. Over years, that pile gets higher. Over generations, it becomes an actual hill, stable enough to support trees, which then hold the whole structure together with root systems, which then attracts wildlife looking for the same dry ground, which makes the spot even more valuable, which means people keep coming back and keep building it higher still. It's not a mound built in one grand construction project with a team of overseers and a hard deadline and a ribbon-cutting ceremony at the end. It's slower than that, and honestly cleverer than that. It's centuries of ordinary daily life quietly accumulating into architecture without anyone in the process necessarily setting out to build a hill at all. The monument built itself out of nothing but habit and the deeply human preference for standing on dry ground. That's the theory gaining serious traction now, that a meaningful number of the Everglades tree islands, maybe not all of them, but far more than anyone previously assumed, are essentially anthropogenic landforms. Human-made high ground, camouflaged for millennia as a purely natural feature, hidden so effectively by dense sawgrass and hardwood canopy that trained ecologists flying over them for decades never had a single reason to look twice, and wouldn't have if not for one very specific lightning strike on one very dry afternoon. LiDAR cracks the map. Open one burned patch of marsh is interesting, sure, but it's not a paradigm shift on its own, and nobody was ready to call it one. What actually turned this into something bigger was what happened once researchers stopped looking at just the ground and started looking at the data from above. In the weeks after the fire, survey teams flew LiDAR passes over the burn zone and surrounding unburned marsh for comparison. LiDAR is laser-based elevation mapping, and it is genuinely one of the best tools archaeology has ever had the good fortune to acquire. It works by firing an enormous number of laser pulses at the ground from a plane and then mathematically filtering out every pulse that bounced off a leaf or a branch instead of actual dirt. Which sounds simple when I describe it that way and is in practice a serious piece of engineering that I am absolutely not qualified to explain in any greater technical depth than that. What it produces is a bare ground map. The same trick that revealed lost cities buried under jungle canopy in Central America a few years back, stripped of every tree and vine and century of overgrowth in the data itself, showing the actual shape of the land underneath. When that approach was applied to the fire-cleared data from the Everglades burn zone, researchers found dozens of additional raised features in the immediate area that weren't on any existing archaeological map, some barely peeking above the marsh surface, easy to miss even on foot without knowing exactly where to step. A handful had never registered on satellite imagery at all, hidden completely by tree canopy for as long as aerial photography of this region has existed as a technology. And then, because researchers are researchers and one interesting data set is never enough when a bigger pattern might be sitting right there, they went back and reprocessed older LiDAR data collected over other parts of the park for entirely unrelated hydrology projects, water flow studies, restoration planning, the genuinely unglamorous work that keeps an ecosystem this size functioning from year to year without anyone writing a script about it. Running that older data back through the same fire-informed lens turned up dozens more candidate sites scattered across sections of the park that had never been flagged for archaeological survey at all, simply because nobody had a reason to look there before this particular fire happened to strip the cover story away on exactly the right afternoon. Suddenly, one wildfire in one corner of the marsh had indirectly triggered a rereading of maps covering a much larger stretch of protected land. And here is the part that is honestly a little funny in a slightly uncomfortable way. Decades of hydrology surveys had been quietly sitting on evidence of ancient human settlements the entire time. Nobody looking twice because nobody was asking that particular question yet. The data was there. The question just hadn't arrived. What untouched actually cost? Now, I want to be genuinely careful here because this is the point where responsible storytelling and exciting overreach part ways, and I'd like to stay on the responsible side of that line. Not every raised feature identified by LiDAR turns out to be a confirmed cultural site once someone actually goes in and properly ground truths it. Some really are just natural peat accumulation doing exactly what peat does. No drama required, no phones calls to archaeology departments, no conference arguments. Distinguishing a genuinely engineered mound from a coincidentally similar-looking natural rise takes actual excavation, actual radiocarbon dating, actual patience, and that work is slow, ongoing, and absolutely not going to wrap up neatly before this video ends. Only a fraction of the newly flagged features have been properly excavated or verified. The rest are sitting exactly where the fire left them, waiting under fresh regrowth for a funded survey season that may still be years away. But the scale of what's being re-examined, the sheer number of features that had simply never been properly looked at until a wildfire and a routine wildlife survey accidentally pointed everyone in the right direction at the same time, that part is not speculation. That part is sitting right there in the data. And it has real practical consequences that go well beyond rewriting a paragraph in a textbook. Everglades restoration is one of the largest, most expensive ecological engineering projects on the planet. Billions of dollars, decades of planning, water flow management, canal removal, habitat reconstruction designed around one core assumption: that the historical baseline being restored toward was a fundamentally natural system, a landscape shaped by water and limestone and nothing else. If a meaningful fraction of the landforms inside that system are actually cultural sites, ancient ones, legally significant under heritage law the moment they're formally identified, then that changes which areas need protection. It changes which areas can be safely modified for water flow purposes. And it changes, frankly, who gets a genuine seat at the table when decisions get made about a landscape that turns out to have a much longer, much more human history than the official story ever gave it credit for. There's also a question worth sitting with rather than rushing past: how much restoration work done with entirely good intentions over the last several decades may have already disturbed sites nobody realized were significant simply because the paperwork said natural feature and nobody had a reason at the time to double check. You can't protect a site you don't know exists. That's not anyone's fault. But it is exactly the kind of gap that a discovery like this one forces an agency to reckon with going forward. Every future project in the region now effectively needs an extra checkpoint that didn't used to be on the list. Is this hump of dirt we're about to move actually 4,000 years of somebody's dinner? What's still down there? Most of this work is still waiting to happen. Excavation in a working protected national park is slow, carefully regulated, and done with extreme caution, specifically because these sites, once confirmed, are irreplaceable and legally protected the moment they're formally identified. Nobody is rushing in with shovels the week after a fire. Consultation with descendant communities whose ancestors most likely built these sites is also part of the process, as it should be, and that tends to slow things down in exactly the right direction, prioritizing respect over speed and publications. Nobody involved in this work seems interested in turning ancient habitation and burial sites into a race to get the paper submitted first. If anything, the pace has been the opposite of rushed, which in a field that sometimes rewards flashy headlines over careful fieldwork is genuinely refreshing to see. What that means practically is that the vast majority of newly visible features are sitting exactly where the fire left them, quietly waiting under a fresh layer of regrowth while funding proposals, survey permits, and community consultation processes move at the speed they actually need to move. The window the fire opened is already closing as the sawgrass grows back and swallows the outlines it briefly revealed. Researchers knew going in that the window was temporary. The LiDAR data, at least, doesn't close. The coordinates are marked. The features are on record in a way they never were before one unlucky lightning strike decided to do the work of a decade of survey flights in a single afternoon. Sometimes the biggest discoveries don't come from expensive, dedicated equipment and 5-year research plans. Sometimes they come from nature doing something destructive enough to strip away the cover story everyone had quietly agreed to believe. A single lightning strike accidentally proved that a landscape 60 years of science had filed under pristine wilderness was actually something far older and far more interesting. A place where people had been quietly, patiently building solid ground to stand on for thousands of years before anyone thought to look carefully at what the ground was actually made of. Not a single dramatic monument. Not a lost city with gold temples, just generations of ordinary people eating meals, piling shells, coming back to the same spot because the spot worked, and slowly, without any of them knowing it, building an argument that would eventually outlast every assumption we made about them. The fire didn't create a mystery. It uncovered one that had been sitting there the entire time, hiding under the grass, waiting for the one season the grass wasn't there to hide it. And there's something almost funny about the fact that it took a natural disaster to undo 60 years of assuming there'd never been any people involved in the first place. Nature handed archaeologists a free excavation, no shovels required, no funding proposal needed, just extremely bad luck for one particular stretch of sawgrass and extremely good timing for everyone flying overhead that week. Every stretch of land we've filed under empty wilderness without ever really checking probably deserves one more look before we trust that label completely. Because if a single lightning strike can quietly rewrite 60 years of assumptions about one of the most studied ecosystems in the country, it makes you wonder what else is hiding out there under nothing more than a few feet of undergrowth, waiting for the right disaster or the right person looking down at exactly the right moment to finally notice it. The fire is out. The sawgrass is already growing back. But the question it left behind isn't going anywhere anytime soon.